All right, Skinwalkers.
Yeah.
Let's do it. You know, you brought some pretty interesting material to this deep dive, a Wikipedia article, and this blog post from the Denver Public Library from their archives. I have to admit, Skinwalkers kind of a chilling subject,
Yeah.
but also strangely compelling. I think we all have that morbid curiosity about, the darker side of folklore.
It's a topic that really captures the imagination.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's right. There's a certain fascination with the kind of beliefs that touch on those primal fears that we all have. What really stands out to you from the material that you've gathered?
The witchery way, that
Yeah.
path to becoming a skinwalker. It's terrifying, but also fascinating. It's not just about random acts of evil. It's like a deliberate choice to embrace this power that just absolutely corrupts. And the Denver Public Library blog post mentions some truly horrific acts associated with this path.
Oh, yeah.
Murdering a close relative. And not just like anybody, specifically a sibling.
Wow.
Grave robbing and even necrophilia. It paints this picture of utter depravity.
It's like looking into the abyss of Navajo morality, isn't it? What's so fascinating here is how it reveals how the Navajo really understand the nature of evil. It's not just about breaking rules, it's about the complete perversion of sacred bonds, that violation of everything their culture holds dear. And you see this reflected in how skinwalkers are portrayed. They're the antithesis of the men and women, those healers who use their knowledge for good.
Yeah, it's like a dark mirror image of those healers, right?
Exactly.
Instead of harnessing that power of the natural world for healing, they're twisting it for destruction.
Right.
And their shape-shifting abilities, that's what always sends chills down my spine.
Yeah.
The Wikipedia entry talks about them becoming coyotes, wolves, bears.
Right.
Is there significance to those particular animals? Why not? Like a rabbit or a deer.
That's a great observation. The choice of animal form really speaks volumes about how the Navajo view the natural world.
Uh-huh.
Coyotes, wolves, bears, these are creatures associated with power, with cunning, and often danger. They're figures of respect, but also fear, even outside of Navajo culture. These animals, they carry a certain mystique.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that a being that's seeking to embody evil
Well,
would take on those forms.
yeah.
It amplifies their threat, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just animals either, right? They can possess people and animals.
Right.
Which adds a whole other layer of fear to this.
Right, absolutely.
Suddenly, it's not just a creature lurking in the shadows. It could be someone you know,
Exactly.
someone you trust.
It introduces that element of paranoia, of not knowing who to trust. It also blurs the lines between the human and the animal world, a concept that's central to many indigenous belief systems. It really challenges our assumptions about what it means to be human, doesn't it?
Definitely. So we've got this creature. It represents pure evil, perverts sacred traditions, and can shapeshift into these, terrifying animals.
Uh-huh.
It's a recipe for some seriously chilling stories. The Wikipedia entry mentioned that Navajo children often hear these tales about skinwalkers, almost like cautionary tales, right?
Yeah.
What kind of stories are we talking about here?
Well, think less Little Red Riding Hood and more epic showdown between good and evil.
Okay.
These stories often depict life or death struggles between skinwalkers and the Navajo people. There are tales of heroic resistance, of individuals and communities banding together to fight off these malevolent forces. It's not just about scaring kids. It's about teaching them about the dangers that lurk in the shadows and instilling in them a sense of courage and resilience.
So there's a real cultural significance to these stories, a way of transmitting values and warnings from one generation to the next. It's interesting, the Wikipedia entry also mentioned how some Navajo children even take European folk tales and replace the villains with skinwalkers.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example of cultural adaptation. They're taking these familiar narratives, like fairy tales, and infusing them with their own specific fears and beliefs. It's like they're reclaiming those stories, making them relevant to their own experiences.
Yeah, which is pretty clever. And speaking of reclaiming, I found it fascinating how both the Wikipedia entry and the Denver Public Library blog post made it a point to mention that the term skinwalker is never used for healers. It really emphasizes the distinction between those who use their knowledge for good and those who choose the path of darkness.
That distinction is crucial to understanding Navajo belief systems. There's a very clear delineation between the sacred and the profane. Healers, with their deep knowledge of herbs, of rituals, and the spirit world, represent the forces of good. They work to restore balance and protect the community from harm. Skinwalkers, on the other hand, are the embodiment of that which must be feared and resisted. And that brings us to a really interesting point. The Wikipedia article mentions, the Navajo people's reluctance to discuss skinwalkers with outsiders. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's understandable, isn't it? I mean, these beliefs are deeply personal, sacred. Sharing them with someone outside the culture, it could feel like a violation, like exposing something vulnerable.
Exactly. It's not just about keeping secrets, it's about protecting something precious.
Yeah.
And there's also that fear of misinterpretation.
Right.
Right. The concern that these beliefs will be sensationalized or taken out of context.
It's like twisting a deeply spiritual belief into like a monster movie trope.
Right.
We see that happening all the time, don't we? It feels like there's this constant tension between wanting to understand other cultures and that risk of exploiting them for entertainment.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. And it's important to acknowledge that even within Navajo culture, there are different perspectives on skinwalkers. It's not a monolithic belief system. Some might be more open to discussing it than others.
So how do we, as outsiders, approach this subject responsibly? How can we learn about these beliefs without contributing to that potential harm?
I think it starts with acknowledging our own limitations. We're looking at this from the outside, and there will always be aspects that we can't fully grasp. But that doesn't mean we can't learn. It's about being respectful, being mindful of the power dynamics at play. Navajo culture has been subject to appropriation and exploitation for centuries.
Yeah.
And we need to be careful not to perpetuate that.
It's like that saying, take only pictures, leave only footprints. But in this case, it's more like listen with respect, learn with humility. And it's about seeking out Navajo voices, understanding how they want their stories and beliefs to be shared.
Exactly. It's their culture, their story to tell. We're guests in that space.
As we're talking about this, I keep coming back to the witchery way. It's such a chilling concept, but I'm kind of curious about the specifics. Are there particular rituals involved in this transformation? What does it actually entail?
The details are shrouded in secrecy, which just adds to the fear factor. But from what we can glean, it's not a simple process. It involves a conscious choice to break with Navajo tradition, to embrace the power of evil. And the acts involved are meant to signify that break.
So the murder of a close relative isn't just a random act of violence. It's like a symbolic severing of the most sacred bonds.
Right, exactly. It's a complete rejection of everything the Navajo hold dear. And the other acts associated with it, the grave robbing, the necrophilia, they all point to a perversion of natural order, a violation of the sacred. It's about becoming something monstrous, both physically and spiritually.
And that transformation, it's not something you can undo, is it? Once you've gone down the witchery way, there's no coming back.
From what we understand, no. It's a one-way journey. And that adds a tragic dimension to the whole concept, doesn't it? The idea that someone could be so consumed by darkness, so desperate for power, that they would willingly give up their humanity.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes me wonder, what drives someone to make that choice? Is it purely ambition? Or is there something more complex at play?
It's a question that has haunted those who study this lore. Some believe it's rooted in a desire for revenge, a need to right some perceived wrong. Others point to a thirst for power, a willingness to do anything to gain control over others.
It's fascinating and a little terrifying to think that those desires could exist within anyone. It really speaks to that duality of human nature, doesn't it? The capacity for both great good and profound evil.
Absolutely. And it circles back to that earlier point about the importance of balance. In Navajo culture, there's this constant awareness of those opposing forces, the need to maintain harmony between them.
And skinwalkers represent the ultimate disruption of that balance. They're like a warning, a reminder of what happens when we stray too far from the path of goodness and light. It's interesting that both the Wikipedia entry and the Denver Public Library post make a point of mentioning that skinwalkers can be either male or female.
That's an important point to highlight, especially since, we often associate witchcraft with women, particularly in Western cultures. In Navajo tradition, the power of evil is not limited by gender. It can corrupt anyone.
And that adds a whole new layer to the concept of the witchery way. It's not just about individual ambition or revenge. It's about this systemic corruption that can affect anyone, regardless of their background or gender.
Exactly. You got it. It speaks to the idea that evil is this insidious force that can permeate all aspects of society. And it highlights the need for vigilance, for a collective effort to resist its influence.
As we've been delving into this world of skinwalkers, I've been struck by this profound sense of fear and dread that surrounds them. And it's not just about being scared of some monster in the dark. It's about this deeper, more existential fear. What do you think is at the root of that?
I think it taps into this primal fear of the unknown, of forces that are beyond our control. Skinwalkers represent this disruption of the natural order, this violation of those boundaries that we really rely on to make sense of the world. And when those boundaries are blurred, when the familiar becomes unfamiliar, it creates this huge sense of unease.
Yeah, like that idea of possession, right? It's not just the creature itself that's terrifying. It's that idea that anyone could be harboring that evil within them. Makes you question who you can trust, even those closest to you.
Exactly. It plays on that fear of betrayal, of the people we love becoming something monstrous. And it also really challenges our understanding of identity. Someone can be possessed by a skinwalker. Does that mean their true self is completely erased? Or is there still a part of them fighting back against that darkness?
Those are some heavy questions. It makes me think about the psychological impact of these beliefs. Growing up with those stories, those warnings about skinwalkers, it must shape your perception of the world in such a profound way.
Absolutely. It instills a sense of caution, this vigilance against, unseen dangers that might be lurking around every corner. But it also fosters a strong sense of community, this reliance on each other for protection and support.
It's like a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fear can divide us, but it can also bring us together.
And that's a theme that resonates throughout human history. Fear can be a powerful tool for control and manipulation, but it can also be that catalyst for collective action, for solidarity in the face of a common threat.
Which brings us back to that question of how we as outsiders can engage with these beliefs respectfully. It's clear there's this huge cultural sensitivity around this topic, that reluctance to share these stories with those outside of the Navajo community. So how do we navigate that tension between curiosity and respect?
I think it starts with humility, recognizing that we may never fully understand the depths of these beliefs, that our interpretations will always be filtered through our own cultural lens. But that doesn't mean we should shy away from asking questions. It's about approaching those questions with a genuine desire to learn, to broaden our understanding, and to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's not just about avoiding offense, it's about being proactive in our efforts to decolonize our thinking, to approach other cultures with a sense of respect and a willingness to listen.
Right. And it's also about being mindful of the ways in which these beliefs have been misrepresented and exploited in the past. We need to be critical consumers of information, to question the sources we encounter, and to avoid perpetuating those harmful stereotypes.
Like those sensationalized portrayals of skinwalkers in movies and TV shows. They often strip away the cultural context, turning a really complex belief system into a cheap thrill.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to seek out authentic Navajo voices, to learn about these beliefs from those who hold them, to hear their stories in their own words.
That's a good reminder for all of us, isn't it? When we're exploring any belief system or culture that's different from our own, we need to prioritize those voices to make sure that we're not just consuming their stories, but also respecting their ownership of those stories.
It's about treating those stories as gifts, not as commodities to be exploited.
Well said. I think that's a fitting note to end on. As we conclude this deep dive into the world of skinwalkers, I hope you've not only learned something new, but also gain this deeper appreciation for the complexity and the power of belief.
And maybe you've even been inspired to continue exploring that world of folklore and mythology, to delve into those stories that, both frighten us and fascinate us, to uncover those hidden truths that they hold about ourselves and the world around us.
Because ultimately, that's what these stories are for, aren't they? They're mirrors reflecting our deepest fears and our hopes, our struggles, our triumphs, our shared humanity.
And they remind us that, even in a world that often feels divided, there's this common thread that connects us all.
Yeah.
The power of story.
So keep listening, keep learning, and keep exploring. Until next time, dear listeners.